Hello, and welcome to episode 5 of the Revive and Thrive podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Blum. Today, we're going to be talking about a couple different things, but we're on the letter E today, and E stands for emotions. So today's topic is an interesting one because in medicine, we are often taught to suppress emotions. Now, that can be a good thing in certain cases, like in a crisis situation. If you're totally melting down, it's not going to be very helpful for your patient or their family or whatever. But the problem is you may in fact be melting down inside, right? And so we are often taught to suppress that a little bit. I mean, if you've ever read The House of God, the first thing is check your own pulse, right? So the problem is that because we are taught to suppress emotion, we're not necessarily taught that that is an all the time kind of thing, right? There's an appropriate time for it and there's a not so appropriate time for it. If that is your default way of operating all the time, then that may not work so well with friends or family, your own children, right? This is a podcast for fathers, right? And so the way you handle something if your kids are having a meltdown, for example, may be very different from the way that you handle it with a patient, and your emotional response may, of course, be different. So the other thing is that when we get comfortable with numbing ourselves to our own emotional responses, sometimes that can become a default way of operating, and then we lose the ability to turn it on and off. There's a term that gets used in mental health circles sometimes called isolation of affect. Affect is the way a person, their outward show of emotions. Different cultures vary in how much affect they show, and different individuals, based on temperament and a bunch of other things, will vary in how much outward emotion that they demonstrate. In certain conditions like major depressive disorder, stuff like that, often affect can be less. For folks that are psychotic, the affect may in fact be diminished or blunted. So there's a lot of sort of things where it may not necessarily be quote unquote normal, but a lot of that is based on a Western way of looking at things. So again, it's going to vary by culture and background. But the whole idea of this thing called isolation of affect is that someone has numbed themselves to their emotional response for long enough, and this is usually because of like trauma or other kinds of things like that everything is kind of just numb. They no longer really can recognize emotions for what they are. And so they're kind of like isolated from their own emotional response. And so this is actually a very common thing that happens for I would say, patients that we may encounter in our field who are, they're the stereotypical sort of like macho man, right? They don't show emotion. They want to be strong, tough, and you ask them what they're actually feeling in various situations, and they kind of don't know. They have a lot of difficulty identifying things like anxiety or anger or frustration because they have sort of a default response to all those things, which is to bury it, which may work for a while, but then it explodes. So often folks who end up in like anger management, kind of things like that, one of the things that often comes out of that is learning to identify emotions before they get to that boiling point. So if you've ever done, or at least any Eastern martial arts or anything like that, there's lots of sayings about this because if anger can be very helpful. It's appropriate in certain situations, but it can also lead you to do really dumb things. And our impulse control, our ability to control our natural impulses for anger and fear and all that kind of stuff can be very helpful in certain situations until it's not. So one of the things you often learn in like for martial arts or self-defense kind of context is that those emotions, they can be those strong emotions like anger and fear and so forth, they can be very powerful, but there are things that they're biological things. You can see it very clearly in non-human animals. Any of you who have a dog may know this very well. They're very outward with their emotions. In many cases, our ability to control emotions and then impulses will increase as we get older. You may notice that with little kids, very little impulse control. But as that frontal lobe develops and the myelination really kind of kicks into teens, 20s, and early 30s, when the brain fully matures, we get a lot better with that. These things will change as we get older, but for some people, they really kind of struggle with this sort of thing. For folks that struggle with ADHD, they're probably a couple years behind the curve when it comes to frontal lobe development, especially earlier on. So someone in their teens and, say early 20s, especially then, you're going to even out a little bit as you get older, but they may still struggle with issues of impulse control. And then we're all worse when it comes to impulse control with a few situations. If you've been drinking, other drugs, if you've had frontal lobe injuries. So what we're talking about is the ability to control, but not necessarily suppress or repress emotions. Because one of the things that happens when people are burnt out is they get to be in this state of kind of operating on almost like autopilot, where we kind of suppress, we push down, push down, push down, push down. And that gets to be a default way of kind of operating with some people. And that then leads us to not necessarily know what to do with all that stuff. The thing is, like with emotions, it's kind of like a chemical fire, I guess you could say. It's not so easy to just cut off the source of what's making the fire burn. There's a time and a place, I guess, for all things. And the emotions that we tend to call so-called negative ones, things like anger and frustration and fear, those kind of things, we have to learn how to deal with them, or they'll deal with you. For those people, and I would say this, you see this a lot in primary care. We certainly see it a lot in psychiatry. You'll see it a lot in, I would say probably rheumatology, for neurology for sure. If you don't find a way to deal with some of those emotions that are sort of hidden inside, they will eventually bubble over. Now, they may come out in a whole host of ways, but what sometimes will happen is people will develop a lot of somatic issues, a lot of issues with things like headaches, stomach issues, chronic abdominal pain, nausea, musculoskeletal issues, lower back pain. We're going to be talking about that in a future thing, but you'll see a lot of these things. And so for those people who are dealing with, I would say, especially chronic headaches, lower back pain in particular, if they're unable to kind of talk about the mental health components of it, and for some people they're really not, it's usually a sign that may be something to look into. What do we do, like especially as physicians? Many of us are in situations where we're under a lot of stress. There's things that are coming at us rapidly. What do we do to manage these complex emotions that come up? Because we're going to get frustrated. We're going to get stressed out. We may be operating on very little sleep. If you're constantly having things thrust at you, it's hard not to be irritable about that, right? So those are facts of life. Those kind of things are natural responses to these things. I think the first thing is actually just to recognize, okay, I'm getting pissed off right now, right? And to not necessarily just, okay, fine, I'll deal with it, right? Because what ends up happening is that we will take on additional responsibility, additional things we have to do until we snap. And usually it's going to veer towards aggression, probably towards someone else, someone you're working with, like the front desk staff, other people that you're working with, like residents, medical students, your colleagues, your patients, your family, right? How many of you have had a bad day at work and then taken it out on, say, your spouse or your kids or dog or whatever, just because it just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. So that's the danger of it, I think. There's a couple different ways little things to think about. One of which is just when you encounter someone who is in crisis, if at all possible, this is the house of God thing, pause, right? Take a few moments, take 5, right? Just to take your own pulse, because if you absorb their crisis, now you're in crisis too. And I would say this is particularly true when it comes to written communication, because if they're sending something through written communication, like an email, a text message, one of those patient portal kind of things like that, it's not an emergency, sort of by default. Sometimes people will send like some emergency sort of thing there, but it can wait. It can wait certainly a minute or two for you to collect yourself, right? So take 5. If you have the chance if you need to discuss it with somebody else, obviously discuss with someone else, but sometimes that's not always possible. Just take a moment to reflect and ask yourself, is this an emergency? Do I have to deal with this right now? The other thing I would say is that when we're making decisions about stuff, confronting, I would say, or making decisions that cause us to push our limits, right? One thing that's often, I think, helpful is to recognize when we're making decisions based on some of these negative emotions, say like fear, where the emotion is dictating our response. Anger is another one, right? Confronting those things and trying to recognize when our decisions are being ruled by emotions is helpful because it allows us to live a fuller and richer life. And I say that because, a fuller and richer life is going to encompass the full range of emotions. They all have their own place, right? A full, rich life is not necessarily a comfortable life. To make progress and to continue to grow as a person means inherently that we're going to be a little uncomfortable in order to do that, right? And so when we get too comfortable, we try to avoid, like take the easiest way out, don't rock the boat. Just recognize that sometimes we just eat that up, right? And you can only kind of bury that for so long until it starts to affect you negatively. Just like in the example that I mentioned about, somatic issues that come up in medicine for our patients. We're not immune to that. The other thing I would say as an offshoot of that is there may be certain situations that you regularly kind of avoid. This is an interesting issue that came up, with the pandemic. People were isolated, so they lost practice in doing day-to-day social things. Afterwards, and certainly in the mental health field, we started to see an incredible increase in social anxiety just because people had gotten out of practice about having regular conversations because everything was being conducted online. And so if you find yourself making decisions based on those things you would like to avoid, maybe you don't have the energy for it or whatever, recognize that, okay, am I making that decision based on because I just don't feel like doing it right now, the energy, but it's normally okay? Or is it something I avoid because it's an area that I could grow in? We tend to, one of the issues that comes out when people are burning out is they feel like they're not growing as a person. They feel like they're not growing as a physician. Having difficult conversations with folks, negotiation, so forth, pushing the envelope about what you're nervous about actually can help you to grow in that way. And that the more you grow and the more you get out of your comfort zone, the more sort of range you have. It's kind of like injury prevention by lifting weights. You're increasing the range of strength that you have to devote to any particular task. Injury prevention via flexibility training, same thing, right? So discomfort is not necessarily bad. The status quo is not necessarily good. So I think recognizing those things, if you have identified with any of this and you find that you tend to push emotions away and you tend to save them for some time, a different time, just have a time when you can say, like, let it all out. Maybe have things that you do that helped you diffuse those emotions, those strong emotions, in a way that's productive and not necessarily destructive. So exercise is a great one. There's plenty of other things that you may have found to do, but I would say, like, that's important just to recognize, because what doesn't come out will find a way to eat you up. And so with that, I would say we are at a wrap for today. If you have other thoughts and questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the comments. Thank you, and I'll talk to you guys next time.